Hello everybody, yet another video. Today I got an interesting question from a person called Kevin, who's recently purchased one of these little beauties. Congratulations Kevin, they're very good cameras. And it was about how do I set up the exposure, because as I kind of explained I think in the film, there is no light meter built into this camera. These date from the early 60s. The only difference to this one is I put a shutter button on it, but still. So he was saying that he's using Kodak Pro 100 negative film, colour negative film, which is a daylight balance film as well. So obviously you don't want to be using that indoors underneath tungsten lights, it'll throw all the colours and everything off. And negative films generally, colour negative films, like a bit of overexposure. It's not unusual, and a lot of YouTubers are doing this. They're overexposing colour negative film by between 1 and 2 stops to bring out that sort of very pastel sort of looking colours in the photographs. So colour negative film is very tolerant to overexposure, unlike reversal film, slide film, which isn't. So he's using 100 ISO, 100 ASA film. And how do you set this camera up to work with that? There's a number of options available, well 3 really. No light meter, no mobile phone. You have to really rely on your experience and the Sunny 16 rule. And the Sunny 16 rule is quite simple really. You set the shutter speed, which on this camera is this first column here, goes 300, 150 and 25. Because he's using 100 ISO film, you set the shutter speed to 100. And the sun is the brightest thing in the universe, as far as we know. Certainly here on planet Earth it is. So on a sunny day with clear skies, an aperture of f16 and a shutter speed the same as the ISO should give you acceptable results. If you want to overexpose by a stop or 2 stops, just open the aperture to f11, that would be 1 stop of overexposure. f8 would be 2 stops of overexposure. Now obviously this is in bright sunlight, so you'll have to gauge how far you're going to open the aperture up depending on how dim the situation is. And obviously once you get down to 2.8, you could then drop the shutter speed down to a 50th and then move the aperture back and start the whole process all over again. It's something that takes time and experience to learn. I'd say if you're shooting on a bright day, start at 100, f11 or f16 and you won't be far wrong. So called the Sunny 16 rule, that is the first method that you could use to try and get some exposure sorted out. The second method, and I see this a lot on YouTube, is light meters. And a lot of YouTubers are using spotlight meters and Sekonics that are all costing several times more than what the camera cost and the film cost. So my suggestion would be, and I know a lot of people don't like these, but make sure you get a good one, a selenium celled light meter. This doesn't require any batteries. The cells at the front here actually generate the electricity to power the meter. Important thing with these is when you're not using them, keep the cells covered up. They only have a limited amount of life, but as long as you store them with the cells covered up, the cells won't deteriorate. Eventually they do stop working, but you know, this is a 1980s light meter and it's still working fine. So this is a handheld light meter. It doesn't require any batteries. This was £2 on the dreaded eBay. £2, way less than the cost of film, and this means that you can measure your exposure and you can get a more accurate indication of what the exposure at any given situation is. If we're metering the light coming from a subject, that's called reflected reading, and that means that we're reading the light that's coming back off of the subject. And the advantage of one of these is that you could measure the highlight areas where the sun is very bright and the shadow areas, and you can expose depending on what you're trying to achieve. Obviously with a colour negative film, I would suggest exposing for the shadows, because the highlights will look after themselves, because remember, colour negative film has got a lot more tolerance to overexposure than underexposure. The other way of reading light is called incidence. And normally you have a little adapter And what you do then is you measure the light that's falling on the subject. This is probably the most accurate way of getting a light reading, because with a reflected one, it depends on, like this is black and this is chrome. So obviously this is going to reflect more light than that is. And meters always try and balance out to what's called an 18% grey card. It's why if you use a meter and photograph snow, it always comes out looking grey, because the meter always tries to bring everything back to a grey. If you meter this way, the light falling on your subject, particularly with portraits, this is quite a good way of doing it. It will give you a far more accurate reading. So make sure when you do buy a cheap light meter that you get an incident attachment for it and learn how to use it. So on this light meter, it's very, very simple to use. We set in our film speed, so you can see there's the ASA column, so that's 50. So we set that to 100. And then what we have to do is read off the scale what the light's saying. The light in here is so low that it's not reading on this big scale. So then we have to change the scale to one that's a bit more accurate. So we can see there, that is reading 7. So we set this dial to 7. And then on the top here, we can read off our shutter speed and our aperture. So this is saying, for example, a 15th at 2.8, an 1/8 of a second at f4, 1/4 of a second at 5.6, etc. So those are the figures that we have to set on the camera as near as we possibly could, because these older cameras only got up to a 300th. They have a different set of timings on them. So in this example, I would have to set this camera probably to a 25th of a second. And a 25th of a second is probably nearer to a 30th, but it will give us a little bit of overexposure, and that says f2. So this is too dim for that film really to take pictures. I'd struggle to get anything out of it, even if it was wide open. This lens opens to 2.8, so everything will be wide open and I'll try and get an image. So that is my preferred suggestion, is that you find yourself a cheap light meter. I say this was £2 on eBay, it doesn't require batteries. Very handy little piece of kit. Very light, you can hardly notice that you're carrying it at all. Another option, if you have a digital camera, is to use a digital camera and use the built-in meter in that. What have I got here? Yeah, that's a bit overkill for it, but still. There's a D3, that's got a spot meter, an averaging meter and all kinds of metering in it. You could use that as a light meter. Seems a bit of a waste to use that as a light meter, but it's possible. It will give you a reading that you could use. The other option is to use a free app for your mobile phone. I think everybody nowadays carries a mobile phone. You know, I'm quite old-fashioned to like mechanical cameras, and I still carry a mobile phone around. I don't use a light meter app on it because I prefer to use a handheld light meter. But yeah, get an app from the App Store, a free one. I wouldn't pay for it. And very much the same as a handheld light meter. You put in your ISO. The phone camera measures the amount of light, and it will give you a reading for your apertures and your f-stops. It will probably be in the more modern scale. On this particular camera, the apertures is the same: 2.84, 5.68. 11 and 16. It's just the shutter speeds that are different, so I would go 1 over, so I would say use 25 instead of a 30th, use a 50th instead of a 60th, use a 100th instead of 125, and use 300 instead of 250 maybe. That one will be a little bit out, but colour negative film is quite tolerant. It's got quite a lot they call exposure latitude, and you should get some nice results out of it. Nice little camera. This is one I've been shooting this week. I've been shooting some colour, some C200 through it, and that's what I did, is I used a handheld light meter like this. I say for £2 you can't really go wrong. So there you go, Kevin. There's some options of how to work out your exposure. It's only 16 rule, but that can be a little bit unpredictable if you can't really tell. Outside of bright sunshine, it's hard to know exactly what to set on the camera, but start with the shutter speed the same as the ISO. Bright sunny weather, no clouds in the sky, f16. As it's starting to get darker and darker, open up your aperture 1 or 2 or 3 stops, or maybe even more, depending on the conditions. Second option, use a handheld light meter. These are very easy to use. Don't spend hundreds of dollars or pounds on an expensive light meter. You don't need a spot meter and a flash meter and all that kind of stuff if you're starting out in film photography. And yeah, you could use a digital SLR camera if you have one, or another film camera that does have a meter in it. And finally, probably the easiest way is to get a free app for your mobile phone. Any light meter app, just look for a light meter app in the store, even though it's Google or Apple, and use that, and that will give you results that you're going to be fairly happy with, I think. And certainly if you're doing paid processing, that should be well enough within the boundaries that they should be able to get you some prints out of it. Thank you very much for watching. I hope that helped, Kevin. Drop me a comment down below and let me know how you get on. Thanks for watching. See you in the next one.